The rise of Souls-likes and just the sheer explosion of popularity of From Software's Demon Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and whatever else they have coming next definitely lit a fuse when it comes to action games and action game design. And for this week's Critical Thought, I want to talk about what From Software did to elevate boss designs and how it's being copied by other developers in either subtle or not so subtle ways. When we talk about the evolution of action games and boss and enemy design, it's important to understand the idea of random and fixed patterns. For a good majority of the action game design, especially from the 80s into the early thousands, enemies and bosses were built on very limited patterns. If you remember the infamous Castlevania, the Medusa, not Metroid, Medusa, going like in that wave pattern. And what the idea of a fixed pattern is that the boss or the enemy is going to do the same thing every time without any deviation from that pattern. And this was a way, or this has become very popular for speedrun based games, as if you know exactly what the boss or enemy is going to do, well, you can exploit that again and again. We saw this heavily used in shmups, bullet hells, Touhou based titles. Now, it's important to note that games that feature tracking based abilities, as in the enemy or boss will use an attack that tracks based on the player's position, that is not an example of a random pattern. They're still doing the same thing, it's just that it's targeted towards you. But starting in the early thousands and then kind of popularized by the Souls-like formula, we began to see the greater use of a random pattern. And random pattern design means that the boss or enemy doesn't just have one attack or two attacks. They can have 4, 5, 6, or even more. And the game will decide what attacks the enemy will use based on multiple factors and its own algorithm. So you're never going to get the enemy to do the same exact thing every time. And this is a very big evolution of action-based design, where for a lot of titles you can exploit the enemy. If you know that every time you go to attack them, they're going to do the same slow, swing, and then they stop, well, you can exploit that, get behind them, or wait for them to finish that second attack and punish. But with random patterns, it requires more adaptability. You don't know what the enemy is going to do at any one time, and that means you have to pay attention. And as this evolved, we've seen developers get very crafty, and they'll design an enemy that they'll have 2 or 3 patterns that start the exact same way, but they'll end differently. And this really began to be seen with Dark Souls 2, where the boss will do an overhead smash followed by a horizontal swing, but then they may sometimes end that combo with trying to grab the player and do massive damage. And this was kind of a way of just saying, oh, you think you're going to try and learn these patterns? Well, think again. And random pattern design is an essential part of basically trying to give this boss as much, or enemies as much, variance in terms of what they can do. And they'll do attacks based on a number of different conditionals. How far are they away from the player? What attack did they just use? How much health does the player have? How much health does the boss have? Is there anything specific going on in the environment? And again, all this can be greatly expanded on based on the creativity and the evilness of the design. And this is why the Souls-like series has really flourished in terms of being these amazing action game set pieces, where it's not just you fighting a boss or fighting a generic enemy. It's this massive event that just takes over. And when we talk about good boss designs, or just good boss practices that From Software has kind of populated or popularized, there's 3 distinct areas that I want to briefly mention, and then we'll talk about things more in the second part of this video. The first is that a good boss is a one-off. As in, this is a fight that you're not going to be doing this again and again and again, or at least in the better examples. This is meant to be this special situation. And the second point, bosses have to be unique from one another. And uniqueness when it comes to a boss doesn't just mean just doing crazy attacks. It can mean being a very special event, such as the dollhouse fight in Resident Evil 8, the Dragon God battle in Demon Souls, and even just fights like the Cloud God in Demon Souls, where the whole point was you having that giant sword that you cleave the sky with. So remember, you don't have to just keep escalating. Now, while escalation is a very big point about this, and the third element that makes up a good boss is that it has to be a grand event. As in, the boss has its own unique environment. With From Software, they usually go a step beyond and give each boss its own orchestral theme, as we saw in Bloodborne. But the idea is that a boss fight in an action game or Souls-like should never be confused for anything but this massive, crazy event. And the bosses that From Software develop, each being its own unique element. And it really comes down to not only teaching or rewarding different areas of mastery, whether it's use of items, use of parrying, dodging, knowing what weapon type to use, and so on. But it really becomes this way of having like a solo in a song that's a very specific point that the player needs to pay attention to. And good boss designs take time. Again, you don't want to be repeating the same exact fight or just taking that boss and then plopping them down the normal world. And we saw kind of a downgrade of that in the original Demon Souls with the Asylum Demon showing up multiple times, Capra Demon becoming a normal enemy, and of course in Dark Souls 2, everyone's favorite fight, the Smelter Demon, which I know all of you who are fans of Dark Souls loved fighting that guy. But what's very interesting is this idea of designing bosses that are in some way, shape, or form similar to the player. And this is one thing that we saw with Sekiro, Bloodborne, Nioh in particular, that the humanoid enemies, they operate along much of the same rules and procedures as the player. A humanoid fight in Sekiro, that boss can't just, jump in the air, grow wings, and start throwing fireballs at people. In Nioh, bosses get guardian spirits, they have their own stamina you have to break, or their own key you have to break. And it's this idea that you're fighting an even-handed opponent. This is not the same as an asymmetrical fight that we often see when it's humanoid versus, monster, with, Bloodborne being a really good example of that. And it lends itself to making these boss fights very unique. It's not just you fighting a giant enemy, you're fighting something that can use much of the same tricks and tactics that you can. In some cases, they may be able to use your own Estus or a healing option. And these fights in particular have to be designed very well. Because if the boss gets the same abilities as you, but also has its own unique advantages, it can be seen as, being overpowered or, you're just breaking the encounter. And we saw that in Nioh when you got to the DLC humanoid fights, where you try to play on the higher difficulties, and the horrible pain that happened when you did that. But with the kind of this redesign of what it means to make enemies and bosses, the idea that you don't need to just copy what everyone else has done, or more importantly, avoid the idea of a puzzle boss. A puzzle boss or an environmental boss is that you can't hurt the enemy unless you do X, Y, and Z. One of the most popular examples of this is from 3D platformers, where the boss does, a crazy attack, you have to dodge it, they get dizzy, you jump on their head, they take 1 point of damage, go to the next phase, wait till they get dizzy, jump on their head, do it one more time, and you beat the boss. The problem with these fights is that they're not really you fighting the boss. You're kind of just going through the motions and waiting for that one, opportune phase that you can actually hit them with. And again, there are some cases, especially if you speedrun games, that you can break triggers or break phases. But for the most part, you're just going to be doing the same thing again and again. So with that said, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to talk about how other genres and other action games have really tried to elevate what it means to create a boss, and what happens when they really go over the top. But before we do that, as always, if you're interested in more of my thoughts on design, be sure to check out my latest offering of books. For entry-level students, we have 20 essential games to study, and then the Game Design Deep Dive series that takes an extensive look at different genres, with horror coming by the end of 2021. While it's hard to tell whether or not these games or modern action games were, directly inspired by Dark Souls, we have seen this greater willingness to experiment with boss encounters in many modern games, not just in the action genre. Now, God of War 2018 may not have been my favorite action game of all time, but it definitely had one of the more fantastic boss encounters in almost all of action games with the Sigrun final fight. And the reason why is that this is the perfect example of what a random pattern battle can be. Sigrun uses every special move from every previous Valkyrie fight. That, I think, is 8 fights worth of special moves, and not only will she use them, she uses them randomly, and there's no rule, I think, as to what order she'll use them in. This is a fight that you have to be on the ball 100% of the time, especially if you play this on Gimme God of War difficulty, because any one of her full combos will probably kill you, even as high as a level as you can go against her. And again, with the fact that she can move or circulate these moves at any time, requires you to adapt at a moment's notice. And it's very similar to kind of Zero Ranger's final boss there. And this is an example again of when you can kind of throw all these different moves at the player. And the thing is, with Sigrun being so mobile, it's not really her using attacks based on proximity, although I do think some of that does take place, especially for some of the more distinct special moves, like her blinding attack, the kind of go into the air and then do a ground stomp attack, and some of the other ones. But this is very much a fight that you could not do this with a fixed power. Like, this fight would just completely not work along those lines. Now, for a more clearer example of this kind of breaking up or, changing the philosophy of boss designs for specific genres, we can turn to Ultrakill. And Ultrakill is basically, what if Doom Eternal was more intense and extreme with its gunplay and agility-based design? And while it may be in early access right now, it still features some of the most exhilarating boss fights I've seen from the genre. And FPSs in general have always been kind of notoriously bad for unique or specialized fights. Part of the reason is that when the player is so mobile and able to, again, react a lot faster than an AI, or at least AI back in the day, it meant that bosses had to be designed usually as just, here's a normal enemy, but far bigger, or having far more health. Or the aforementioned puzzle fights, where you have to do X, Y, and Z so then the boss can be heard, but there's no indication whether or not the boss is actually taking damage. But with Ultrakill, the game features several boss fights, and this is just in the very first act alone, that feel very much like a Devil May Cry battle. You are fighting a high-speed kind of humanoid or mechanical, in some case, battle with an enemy. The V2 fight in particular is basically a mirror match. You're fighting a guy who uses much of your same attacks and tactics, and if you piss it off or get out of its range, it will hunt you down. And this is a fight that will always begin with a huge explosion, not unlike that thunder that you just heard in the background as I'm trying to record this part, which I'm leaving in just for the perfect moment there. But a lot of what makes kind of modern boss fights work and kind of breaking these rules is that the fight is such a unique element that it really forces the player to have to adapt to a different rule set. And with Ultrakill, with the Gabriel and V2 fights, you can really see this come into play, that you can't fight them the same way as the other enemies. But in the same token, learning the rules of the game and learning how it all works in terms of what your best tactics are and how to exploit it will often lead to these fights being very easy once you've mastered the game. And they act as really great kind of final tests, or just simply tests, on the player's mastery of the rules and systems. The Sword Saint Isen, I'm pretty sure I just butchered that, fight from Sekiro is another really good example. That there's a reason why a lot of people who've made it that far in the game find that battle to be so easy. It's because it is simply just, hey, did you figure out how to play Sekiro correctly? Y/N. And if you did, then Isen doesn't do anything out of the ordinary. It is just that final test of all your masteries of the parrying and the lightning counter move. And it is a very solid fight in that game. And this is what I like to see from unique boss encounters, that it's about testing the player in a way that you don't already have in your title, and why so many FPS and action games in the past have typically faltered. That if it's just normal enemy but bigger, or a fight that you really have no control over, like an environmental one, then it's not really testing the player on anything. And there's a lot more we can certainly talk about in terms of boss designs and boss-based gameplay. But again, if you're looking for inspiration, definitely pick up any of these Souls-likes from Software. I'm personally, I guess, partial to Bloodborne, as that's I think my favorite. But again, you can see how different each encounter is, and you want that to be in your game. Going back to Segrin that I showed earlier, that yes, this is a fight that uses all the attacks you've already seen, but it's done in a way that doesn't work like those previous fights. Because she can switch to any of the 8's patterns at will, you can't rely on the same timings and the same strategies that you did for each one of those battles. The same goes for Zero Ranger, where yes, it's the same attacks, but because they are random and that she can transition to any one of them when she wants, there is no fixed pattern for it. And this is often why when we look at stuff like tool-assisted speedruns or task bots, that they're not really used in games like this, because you can't program a bot to react or improvise in the same way as a player can when the boss is just throwing all manner of random abilities at you. So with that said, to wrap up our video for this week, what are some of your favorite boss battles? Whether they were a unique encounter, some random pattern craziness, or even just a unique situation that wasn't in the game prior. Something like the dollhouse of Resident Evil 8, for instance. Or even some like over-the-top situation like Ludwig that I didn't mention from Bloodborne as well. Let me know in the comments below, and as always, be sure to check out our Discord and Patreon link down below. And come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some of the art and science of games. Until next time, take care.